The sun was high in the bright sky over his head, and the heat on his back was unbearable. Rowing in the midday sun took every ounce of energy and then some. By the time the sun began to sink into the horizon, his eyes would be mere slits from squinting all day. There was no time to rest the muscles, now aching and screaming for a break. To make the shore by nightfall required extreme effort, and if they were to survive, the little 40-foot open vessel must be beached. North winds would surely swamp the boat otherwise and leave the men exposed to the waters teeming with sharks and all manner of predators. Yes, everyone's survival was dependent upon each pulling against their oars with all of their might. A simultaneous effort with maximum output. Any stoppage, you see, or slowdown could be costly, with the ultimate price being death. John pulled rhythmically against his oar like a machine. After a while, the body becomes conditioned to the pain of the muscles tearing and blood vessels swelling. A numbing sensation takes over, and one's even left with a euphoric sense of routine, which becomes welcome and sometimes even comforting. John knew that his rowing team was dedicated to their own survival, and that everybody on board had his own reason to survive and make landfall. After several hours of intense rowing, John looked up from his trance and realized that only 22 out of the 24 were rowing. For some reason, 2 guys were standing near the front of the boat, drinking water and pointing out to sea. John concluded they must be consulting the navigator on directional signs, and he went back to his own work with his head down, putting in even more effort than before. Another long period of time went by before he thought to raise his eyes from the deck and survey their progress. This time John noticed about a half a dozen men that were standing about and talking and ignoring their oars. He mentioned this to the man seated beside him. He grunted back that some of the men were given special relief passes for periods of time due to muscle fatigue syndrome. It was against the law to deny them their rest periods based on a doctor's note. John was sure that they would be back at their oars in short order, not for him to flout the law. Besides, everybody on board had the same incentive to survive and get back to shore. He redoubled his efforts and lost himself once more in his work. The sounds of the lapping from his oar became a symphony of joy in his ears. Not because he liked to row so much, but with each note played, he was closer to home. With every dip of his oar, he was hearing the sounds of life, joy, and happiness waiting for him at the end of his journey. That alone was keeping him going through the exhaustion and pain of extreme effort. He smiled to himself and knew that with everyone rowing, he'd surely be holding his beloved Tamara very soon. Expecting their first child, he was the proudest and happiest man on earth, he was sure of that. More time went by. The sun was making a slow and languid move to the ocean. The heat was intense and the thirst overwhelming. John had devised a way to strap his water bottle to his oar, ensuring that he'd never have to stop completely to keep his body hydrated. When he reached for his bottle, he became aware of a slowing down of the forward momentum. Wondering what was going on, he picked his head up again and he looked around. To his utter amazement, he was the last man rowing. Not a single paddle outside of his own was in the water. Every man was lying about or standing on deck enjoying a smoke or a cool drink of water. Finishing his drink of water to lubricate his vocal cords and hydrate his parched mouth, he set down his own oar and yelled out, "What are you all doing? I'm the only one left rowing. How long have we been going in circles? When did you stop rowing? Don't you want to live? Don't you want to survive? Pick up your oars. Row for the love of God. Get back to work." A large man standing closest to him looked down at John. He scowled and said, "If they ain't going to row, then neither am I." The behemoth was pointing to a group of weakly men huddled nearest the bow, in the protection of the navigator who was tasked with enforcing the law and the code of the boat. John looked at the navigator and said, "Aren't you going to make them row? What's wrong with you? We'll all die out here if we don't get back to work. I can't be the only one rowing or we'll go nowhere. Pick up your oars and work. Work for yourselves, your families." The navigator spoke up and said, "Hey, I'm just following the rules, man. These guys have notes from their doctors. I have to honor muscular fatigue syndrome policy. They cannot be forced to row against their will. Then they'll die. Is that what they want? Do you want to follow that policy or survive? Look, John, I don't make the rules. I enforce them. John scanned all the men just standing around, and he stood up on his bench. "Will none of you join me?" he said. "Will none of you pick up your own oars and put us back in motion going home? Have you all lost the will to live?" A portly man with arms like pythons sat down and said, "Why should I work my tail off for what they're paying me? The chief oarsman's making twice what I make." John looked at him in the eye and said, "How long have you been an oarsman?" "This is my second journey," he said. "Well," John said with a tone of sympathy, "the chief's been rowing for 11 years. Don't you think you could be making what he is if you put your mind to it, and you put in the time, and you earned that position?" John was losing his temper now. "What about the rest of you? Don't you want to live?" Yelling and screaming towards John quickly erupted in a storm of voices with no one listening to the other, everyone talking and arguing over each other. John felt alone, empty, and without words to describe what he was witnessing. With a sigh of fury and determination not to go down on this boat, John picked up his own oar, sat in his place, and he pulled against the concrete of the ocean with everything he had left in him. The boat began to spin. With every stroke, John sped up the circular path of the vessel. Soon the burly man with huge arms picked up his oar. Inspired by John's desire to live and the sweat of his brow, he too rowed with a vengeance. One by one, the men of strength and character picked up their oars and took their places. The vessel began to move slowly forward, and then with a gust of wind at their backs, the boat started to soar once more. The men of excuses rested upon the policy and refused to join the work. They could be heard proclaiming their rights for miles around about how it wasn't fair to violate their state-sanctioned opt-out. John and enough of the other men worked through the afternoon and late into the night. They didn't make landfall by sunset, but several hours later. Nevertheless, the small ocean-going boat with its precious cargo of determination arrived at last, avoiding the serious weather that was brewing out there on the horizon. John's back was blistered from the sun, his hands were torn to shreds, and every joint in his body was on fire. He hobbled to the side of the boat, slowly walked the gangplank that was lowered into the shallow water. His feet felt the embrace of the cool water, and he sunk his toes deep into the sand. He attempted to speak, but could only mouth the words, "Thank you, God." Just then his wife caught his eye. The pain, the suffering, the work, and the brutal day of labor melted away as he ran to her. It only takes one person to make the difference. Will you be the difference?
Well, I won't back down. No, I won't back down. You can stand me up at the gates of hell, but I won't back down. Gonna stand my ground, I won't be turned around, and I'll keep this world from dragging me down. Gonna stand my ground, and I won't back down. Hey, baby, there ain't no easy way out. Hey,